Mark and I had been inseparable for over a decade. He wasn't just my husband. He was my first love, my rock, and the father of our 2-year-old son, Ethan. We'd built our lives around each other, growing from naive teenagers to adults with a cozy home and dreams of a bright future. With another baby on the way, life should have been perfect. But perfection, I've learned, is often a mask that cracks far too easily. It all started when Tom, Mark's best friend, moved into our guest room. Tom's life had imploded after discovering his wife's devastating betrayal, years of lies unraveling in an instant. The 2 children he'd adored and raised weren't biologically his. The pain in Tom's eyes when he told us the truth was unbearable. He didn't cry, didn't scream. He just seemed hollow, like a man who had lost his anchor. Mark had always been close to Tom. They'd grown up together, shared everything from schoolyard fights to wedding speeches. Mark took Tom's pain personally, like a wound he couldn't heal but couldn't stop poking at. I tried to be supportive, too. I cooked Tom's favorite meals, made space for his grief, and gave Mark the room to be there for his friend. But as Tom settled into our home, something began to shift in my marriage. Mark's changes were subtle at first. He was quieter, less present. He'd sit on the couch staring at his phone for hours, typing furiously but rarely offering more than a shrug when I asked what he was doing. Conversations between us became strained. Where were you and who were you with? Were suddenly his go-to questions whenever I came back from running errands. It wasn't outright accusatory, just off. At first, I brushed it off as stress. Tom's presence in our home meant a constant reminder of betrayal. Watching her best friend's world fall apart would get to anyone. I thought Mark just needed time to process, to remind himself that not all marriages end in lies. I didn't know I was the one he'd soon begin to doubt. The moment that shattered my perception of our relationship came on a rainy Wednesday night. I've been searching for a lasagna recipe, Mark's favorite comfort food, on my laptop. Mine had been running slow, so I grabbed his without a second thought. As soon as I opened the browser, a string of search suggestions filled the screen. The top one read, "How to get a DNA test without the mother knowing." I froze, my hands trembling over the keyboard. For a moment, I convinced myself I must have misread it. But when I clicked, the history confirmed my fears. There were multiple searches: DNA testing services, paternity fraud stories, even forums where men discuss their experiences. My stomach twisted into knots. 1,000 thoughts raced through my mind. Was he doubting Ethan? Was he questioning my fidelity? Why hadn't he talked to me if something was bothering him? I sat there staring at the screen, unable to reconcile the man I loved with the man who'd been researching behind my back. That night, I couldn't sleep. Mark came to bed as usual, oblivious to the storm brewing inside me. I lay stiff beside him, watching the rise and fall of his chest in the dim light. How could someone who shared my every dream and fear be capable of something like this? The next morning, I confronted him. I waited until Tom had left for a walk, giving us privacy in the kitchen. "Mark," I started, keeping my voice steady, even though my heart pounded. "Why are you looking up DNA tests?" His reaction was immediate. His face paled, and his eyes darted away like a child caught stealing. "What are you talking about?" he said, his voice too defensive. "Don't lie to me," I snapped, pulling up the search history on his phone. "I saw everything. Just tell me the truth." For a moment, I thought he'd apologize, explain it away as a misunderstanding. But instead, he exhaled sharply and said, "I just need to know, okay? After what happened to Tom, I can't stop thinking about it. What if Ethan isn't mine?" His words felt like a slap. "What if Ethan isn't yours? Are you serious?" I asked, my voice trembling with anger and disbelief. "How could you even think that?" "It's not personal," he said, his tone defensive. "I trust you, but men need to be sure. Look at what happened to Tom. He thought those kids were his for years. You trust me?" "That's the biggest lie you've ever told me," I shot back, tears welling in my eyes. "If you trusted me, this wouldn't even be a thought in your head. Ethan is your son, Mark. There's no question about that." He ran his hands through his hair, clearly frustrated. "I don't want to fight about this. I just need peace of mind. Can't you understand that?" "No," I said firmly, my voice breaking. "I can't understand how the man I've been with since I was 16 could doubt me like this. If you don't know by now that I would never cheat on you, then I don't think I know you either." Mark didn't apologize. He didn't beg me to forgive him. He just stood there, as if my pain were a necessary casualty of his quest for peace of mind. That night, I asked him to leave. Tom was still in our guest room, oblivious to the chaos he'd unknowingly inspired. I didn't tell him why Mark packed a bag and stormed out the door, leaving me alone with Ethan. For the first time in years, my house felt unbearably empty. As I put Ethan to bed, he reached out for Mark's usual goodnight kiss, his little face crumpling when I told him Daddy wasn't home. I tucked him in, tears silently streaming down my face as I kissed his forehead. Upstairs, I stared at my reflection in the bathroom mirror, searching for answers in the face that had suddenly become unrecognizable. How had everything gone so wrong so quickly? I didn't know then that this was only the beginning. It was a regular evening, or at least it should have been. Mark had mentioned he'd be late from work, so I decided to use the time to cook one of his favorite meals, lasagna. Ethan was watching cartoons in the living room, giggling at something on the screen, his laughter the only bright spot in an otherwise heavy week. I reached for my laptop, but it was charging upstairs, so I grabbed Mark's instead. I'd used it plenty of times before for quick searches or to check emails. When I opened the browser, though, I froze. The search bar auto-filled almost instantly, the words so hauntingly specific that they didn't feel real at first. How to get a DNA test without the mother knowing. The air seemed to vanish from the room. My chest tightened, and the laptop felt suddenly heavy on my lap. I stared at the screen, rereading the words over and over again, as if repeating them would make them mean something else. Anything else. But there was no misinterpreting it. I clicked on the search history. It wasn't a one-time curiosity. Mark had been thorough. Paternity test kits near me. Can you secretly test a child for DNA? Signs a child isn't yours. The phrases felt like daggers, each one cutting deeper than the last. I couldn't move. For a long time, I just sat there, my mind racing with questions that had no answers. Was he doubting Ethan's paternity? Did he think I'd cheated on him? My stomach churned with nausea, my thoughts spinning into a dark spiral. Instead of confronting him that night, I closed the laptop, placed it back on the table, and tried to go about the evening as if nothing had happened. My hands shook as I chopped onions for the lasagna. By the time Mark came home, I couldn't even look at him. "How's Ethan?" he asked casually, setting down his bag. "He's fine," I replied, my voice clipped. I busied myself stirring the sauce, avoiding his gaze. Mark didn't notice, or maybe he didn't care. He kissed Ethan on the forehead, commented on how good dinner smelled, and disappeared into the shower like everything was normal. I sat at the table later, pushing food around on my plate, nodding at his small talk about work. That night, lying in bed beside him, I stared at the ceiling. My mind replayed every moment of our life together, searching for clues I'd missed. Every time I stayed out late with friends. Every time a male coworker's name came up in conversation. Had he been stewing in suspicion all this time? Or was this new? Ethan was only 2 years old, our beautiful, happy little boy. His giggles and bright eyes were the best part of every day. How could Mark look at him and think, even for a second, that he wasn't his? I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, after tossing and turning for hours, I decided I couldn't carry the weight of it alone anymore. I waited until Ethan was napping, ensuring we'd have no interruptions. Mark was in the kitchen, scrolling through his phone with a mug of coffee in hand. "Mark," I started, keeping my voice steady, "why are you searching for DNA tests?" His reaction was immediate. He froze mid-sip, his eyes darting up to meet mine. He looked caught, like a deer in headlights. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice sharp with defense. "Don't play dumb," I said, my heart pounding. "I used your laptop last night. I saw your search history." He set his coffee down and ran a hand through his hair. It's not what you think." "Then what is it?" My voice cracked despite my efforts to stay calm. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're doubting Ethan's paternity. Are you seriously accusing me of cheating on you?" Mark sighed, a heavy, exasperated sound that made my blood boil. "I'm not accusing you of anything," he said. I need to be sure, okay? It's nothing personal." "Not personals?" I repeated, incredulous. "You think our son isn't yours, and that's not personals?" "It's not like that," he said, his tone growing defensive. "Look at what happened to Tom. He thought he had this perfect family, and it was all a lie. I just don't want to end up like him." "You're not Tom," I snapped, tears burning in my eyes. "I've never given you a reason to doubt me, Mark. Not once. How could you even think this?" He hesitated for a moment before saying the words that would shatter whatever was left of my composure. "I just don't want to be free childcare for someone else's kid." I gasped, the air knocked out of me as if he'd physically struck me. free childcare? That's how he saw Ethan? Our Ethan? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. You're disgusting, I whispered, my voice trembling. You don't trust me. You don't even see Ethan as your son anymore. Do you even love him? Of course I love him, he said quickly. But love isn't enough. I need to know. The conversation ended with me storming out of the kitchen, tears streaming down my face. Mark didn't follow me. He didn't apologize or try to explain himself further. He just stayed in the kitchen, sipping his coffee like his words hadn't torn my world apart. I spent the rest of the day avoiding him, locking myself in the nursery to fold baby clothes and calm my nerves. But the truth was, I couldn't unhear his words. By the time Ethan woke up, Mark was gone. Off to work, or maybe just out of the house to avoid me. Either way, I didn't care. I held Ethan close that afternoon, inhaling his baby soft scent and trying to convince myself that everything would be okay. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't be. Something between Mark and me had broken, and I wasn't sure it could ever be fixed. By the time Mark came home that evening, I had already made up my mind. The search history, his cruel words, the gut-wrenching betrayal, it was all too much to process. I wasn't just angry, I was devastated. The man I thought I knew had been replaced by someone cold, calculating, and capable of tearing our family apart without a second thought. Mark walked through the door like nothing had happened, casually hanging his keys on the hook by the door. "What's for dinner?" he asked, his tone so nonchalant it made my blood boil. "I think we need to talk," I said, my voice sharp. I stood in the middle of the living room, arms crossed, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. He hesitated, glancing at me with a mix of irritation and caution. "About what?" "You know what?" I snapped. "This DNA test. Your doubts. Everything you've said and done in the past week. I'm done pretending this is normal." Mark sighed and set his bag down on the couch. "I already told you, it's not personal. I just need—" "No." I cut him off, my voice trembling. "You don't get to say it's not personal, Mark. It's our son. It's me. It's us. If you can't see how personal this is, then you don't belong here." For a moment, he just stared at me, his expression unreadable. Then, to my disbelief, he shrugged. "Fine. If you're going to make it a big deal, I'll pack a bag." I blinked, stunned. "That's it? You're not even going to fight for us? For Ethan's?" "I'm not leaving for good," he said, his voice annoyingly calm. "I'll stay somewhere else for a few days while I figure things out. Once the test comes back, we can talk." "Figure things out?" I repeated, incredulous. "What is there to figure out, Mark? The only thing that should matter is the fact that Ethan is your son, and I've never given you a single reason to doubt me. But instead of trusting me, you'd rather throw away everything we've built for some ridiculous paranoia." He sighed again, running a hand through his hair. "I'm not throwing anything away. I just need answers." "Then leave," I said, my voice cold. "If that's all Ethan and I mean to you, then go. Because I can't live like this." Mark didn't argue. He went upstairs, grabbed a duffel bag, and started packing. As I stood in the hallway, clutching Ethan in my arms, I felt like I was watching a stranger. He didn't look sad or conflicted, just determined. Ethan sensed something was wrong. He clung to me tightly, his little face buried in my shoulder. When Mark came downstairs, bag in hand, Ethan reached out for him, tears streaming down his cheeks. "Daddy," he cried, his voice breaking. Mark froze, guilt flickering across his face for the briefest moment. He kissed Ethan on the forehead and muttered, "I'll be back soon, buddy. Daddy just needs to sort some things out." As the door closed behind him, Ethan's cries grew louder, and my heart shattered. I held him close, whispering soothing words I didn't even believe myself. That night, after Ethan finally fell asleep, I sat in the living room, staring at the empty space where Mark's shoes used to be. The weight of it all crashed down on me. The betrayal, the doubt, the overwhelming sense of loss. It wasn't just about the DNA test anymore. It was about the fact that Mark had been willing to risk everything for a sliver of certainty. The next morning, I called a counselor. I didn't know if therapy could fix what was broken between us, but I had to try. For Ethan's sake, for the baby growing inside me, I needed to know I'd done everything I could to save our family. When I told Mark about the appointment, his reaction was as frustrating as it was predictable. "What's the point?" he asked, his voice flat. "We'll go in circles until we have the results. Let's just wait." "It's not about the test," I snapped. "It's about us. Don't you see that? This isn't just about Ethan anymore, Mark. It's about the fact that you don't trust me. It's about the way you've treated me, the way you've made me feel like I'm not enough. If we don't fix that, there's no point in waiting for any results." Mark didn't respond right away. When he finally did, his words only deepened the chasm between us. "I'll go to therapy if the results say Ethan is mine," he said. "If not, there's no point." His answer left me speechless. It wasn't just about the test anymore, it was about power, control, and the cracks in our foundation that had been hidden for far too long. Mark refused to attend the first session, leaving me to sit alone in the counselor's office, pouring out my heartbreak to a stranger. I told her everything about Tom, the search history, Mark's coldness, and the unbearable weight of his doubts. The counselor listened intently, her expression kind but serious. "It sounds like Mark's doubts go beyond Ethan," she said gently. "Has he always struggled with trust?" I thought about it. There had been moments over the years, little things I'd brushed off as harmless. Questions about old boyfriends, jokes about men I worked with, subtle comments that seemed playful at the time. But they weren't playful now. They were seeds, and Tom's betrayal had watered them until they grew into this poisonous, unyielding doubt. When the session ended, I felt lighter but no less certain about the future. Mark wasn't just doubting Ethan, he was doubting me, our relationship, and everything we'd built together. And for the first time, I wasn't sure if we could survive it. 2 weeks after Mark left, I was still grappling with the emptiness his absence had left behind. Ethan had stopped asking for his dad as frequently, though every now and then he'd mention him in that innocent, matter-of-fact way only a child could. My days had become a blur of toddler chaos, doctor's appointments for the pregnancy, and the suffocating weight of uncertainty about what my future would look like. I was in the middle of folding laundry one afternoon, surrounded by Ethan's tiny shirts and baby clothes I'd just unpacked from storage, when the doorbell rang. It startled me. I wasn't expecting anyone. Peering through the window, I saw a woman standing on the porch. She looked to be in her late 20s, maybe early 30s, with long dark hair pulled into a low ponytail and a swollen belly that left no doubt she was pregnant. Her face was flushed, either from the heat or something more emotional, and she seemed hesitant as she shifted her weight from one foot to the other. I opened the door cautiously, a polite smile already forming. Before I could say anything, she looked up and said, "Is Mark here?" Her voice was calm, almost casual, but the question made my stomach drop. "Mark," I repeated, trying to keep my tone steady. "Why would he be here?" She furrowed her brow, confusion spreading across her face. "He lives here, doesn't he?" My heart started pounding, but I forced myself to stay composed. "Mark doesn't live here anymore," I said carefully. "I'm his wife, and he moved out 2 weeks ago." The moment I said wife, her entire demeanor shifted. She took a step back, her hand flying to her belly, like she needed to shield herself. "Wife," she echoed, her voice breaking. "What are you talking about? He told me you were his ex." The blood drained from my face. "Ex." My voice came out as a whisper. She nodded, her eyes darting between me and the inside of the house like she was trying to piece something together. "Mark told me you two were divorced. He said he was only staying here temporarily to help with the kid." It was like the ground disappeared beneath me. My hands gripped the doorframe for support, my breath coming in shallow gasps. "Who are you?" I finally managed to ask, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. She straightened her posture, as if bracing herself for a fight. "I'm his fiancé," she said, her voice laced with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "Fiancé." The word hit me like a freight train. My mind refused to process it. "That's not possible," I said, shaking my head. "We've been married for 10 years. We have a child together. I'm pregnant with a second." "I'm pregnant too," she shot back, her hand still protectively over her belly. "No," I whispered, tears welling in my eyes. "No, that can't be true." She reached into her bag and pulled out her phone, unlocking it with shaking hands. "I didn't want to believe it either," she muttered. "But when I found this address, I had to come and see for myself." She thrust the phone toward me, and I stared in horror at the photo she'd pulled up. There was Mark, my Mark, smiling warmly, his arm wrapped around her shoulders. In another picture, he was kissing her forehead, his hand resting on her pregnant belly. And, the worst one, it was taken in my kitchen. My heart felt like it was physically breaking. How could he do this? I choked out, barely able to get the words past the lump in my throat. "I don't know," she said bitterly. "He told me he loved me. He said you were out of the picture. He proposed to me." I swayed on my feet, my mind reeling. He proposed to you? Yes, she said, holding out her hand to show me the ring. It was simple but elegant, nothing I'd ever seen before. 6 months ago. He said he was finally ready to move on. 6 months. My knees almost buckled. 6 months ago, I was just starting to show with this pregnancy. 6 months ago, Mark was still crawling into bed with me, holding me close, telling me he loved me. 6 months ago, we were celebrating Ethan's 2nd birthday as a family. The woman's voice broke through my spiraling thoughts. I didn't know, she said softly. I swear I didn't know. If I had, she trailed off, looking down at her belly with a mixture of sadness and fury. I believe you, I said quietly, though my words felt hollow. I wanted to scream, cry, throw things, but all I could do was stand there, numb and broken. Do you know where he is? She asked, her voice hardening. No, I admitted. He hasn't been back since he left. I thought he was staying with friends. Well, she said, her lips pressing into a thin line, when you find him, tell him we need to talk. I'm done with his lies. She turned to leave, her posture stiff, but before she stepped off the porch, she paused. I'm sorry, she said, her voice softer now. I didn't mean to hurt you. I had no idea. I nodded, unable to speak. She walked away, leaving me standing in the doorway, clutching the edge of the frame like it was the only thing holding me upright. When the door closed behind me, I sank to the floor, my legs unable to support me anymore. Ethan wandered over, tugging on my sleeve. Mama, he asked, his wide eyes filled with concern. I pulled him into my arms, holding him tightly as the tears finally came. He was too young to understand, but his presence grounded me. Mark had lied. Not just about me, not just about Ethan, but about everything. And now I had to figure out how to pick up the pieces. For my children. For myself. For a life that would never be the same. After the door closed, and I managed to pull myself together, I paced the living room, my mind racing. I couldn't let this end with Sarah walking away. I needed answers, and she deserved them, too. I opened the door and called out to her. She stopped at the end of the walkway, turning with a wary look. Wait, I said, my voice trembling. Please. Come inside. Sarah hesitated for a moment before walking back, her hand protectively cradling her belly. Her eyes darted around the room as she stepped into the house, taking in the pictures on the walls, photos of Mark, Ethan, and me smiling in happier times. Do you want some water? I asked, unsure of how else to start this. My hands were shaking as I gestured toward the couch. She shook her head. No, I'm fine. I don't even know what to say. Neither do I admitted, sinking into the armchair across from her. My voice cracked as I added, but I think we need to figure this out. For a few moments, we sat in silence, the tension so thick it felt like it could suffocate us both. Finally, Sarah broke it. Mark told me you cheated on him, she said, her words sharp but hesitant. He said Ethan wasn't his, and that you'd admitted it. That's why he stayed here, to help out until the divorce was finalized. She emphasized the last part with a bitter laugh. My stomach turned. That's a lie, I said firmly. I've never cheated on Mark. Ethan is his. I offered to do a DNA test to prove it, but, God, I can't believe he told you that. Sarah looked away, her lips pressing into a tight line. He made it sound like he was the victim, she said softly. That you were this manipulative, bitter woman trying to control him with a child that wasn't even his. I didn't want to believe him at first, but then he'd show me things, texts where you were angry, pictures of Ethan where he'd say he didn't see any resemblance. Of course I was angry. I snapped, then immediately softened my tone. I had no idea he was seeing someone else. And Ethan is his, Sarah. I swear to you. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. Then why would he lie about it? Why go through all this trouble? I don't know, I admitted, my voice breaking. But I think we need to piece it together because this isn't just about him lying to you. It's about him destroying everything we built. Over the next hour, we went through the timeline of Mark's betrayal, one agonizing detail at a time. Sarah told me he'd proposed to her 6 months ago, while I was 6 weeks pregnant with our second child. I remembered that time clearly. Mark had been distant, claiming he was overwhelmed with work and the stress of supporting Tom. Now I realized he wasn't pulling away because of stress. He was carving out space for his new life with Sarah. He said he was moving out soon, Sarah continued, her voice trembling. He told me you were holding things up with a divorce, dragging your feet because you didn't want to let go. I shook my head in disbelief. I didn't even know we were supposed to be divorcing, I said bitterly. He never said a word. I thought we were happy. Or at least trying to be. Sarah wiped her eyes, her anger breaking through the sadness. And you're pregnant, she said, her gaze falling to my stomach. I can't believe how could he do this? To both of us? I pulled my sweater tighter around me, feeling exposed. I don't know, I whispered. But he's been lying to both of us for months, maybe years. And he was so good at it. I didn't even suspect anything until recently. Sarah stared at me, her expression a mixture of pity and shared pain. He made me believe we were building a future, she said. I even told my family about him. They were so excited for the baby. And now, she trailed off, her voice thick with emotion. I reached out instinctively, my hand brushing hers. You didn't know, I said softly. You're not to blame for this. Mark did this. He lied to both of us. She nodded, tears spilling over her cheeks. What do we do now? I didn't have an answer for her. My head was spinning, my heart shattered into pieces. I excused myself briefly, walking upstairs to grab my phone. I needed to call Mark. When I returned, Sarah was standing by the fireplace, staring at a framed photo of Mark holding Ethan in his arms. He looks so happy here, she said quietly, her voice tinged with disbelief. I don't understand how someone who can do this could pretend like that. Neither do I admitted, dialing Mark's number with trembling hands. The phone rang twice before going to voicemail. I tried again. Same result. He's not answering, I said, my voice hollow. I don't even know where he is. Sarah sighed, setting the photo back on the mantel. Well, when you find him, she said bitterly, tell him I'm done with his lies. And that he needs to take responsibility for this baby, whether I ever see him again or not. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. As she gathered her things to leave, she paused in the doorway. I'm sorry, she said softly, looking genuinely pained. I didn't mean to hurt you. I really didn't know. I believe you, I said, my voice cracking. And I'm sorry, too. For everything. After she left, the house felt heavier than ever. I sat on the couch, staring blankly at the photos on the wall. Ethan toddled over, climbing into my lap, his little face full of innocent joy. Love you, Mama, he said, his small arms wrapping around me. I held him close, tears streaming down my face. I love you, too, baby, I whispered. Mark's lies had destroyed so much, but Ethan was my anchor. For him, and for the baby I carried, I knew I had to figure out how to move forward. Mark's double life had shattered the world I thought I knew, but I was determined to rebuild it. Without him, if I had to. I'd been rehearsing this moment all day. My anger, my disbelief, my heartbreak, they'd swirled together into a volatile storm, waiting to be unleashed. I wasn't sure how it would play out, but I knew one thing. Mark wasn't walking back into this house without facing the truth. After Sarah left earlier, I'd called her again, my voice trembling but firm. He's coming here tonight, I told her. If you want answers, this is your chance. To her credit, Sarah didn't hesitate. I'll be there, she said. When Mark walked through the door that evening, I was already seated at the dining table. Sarah sat across from me, her arms crossed over her belly, her expression a mixture of anger and devastation. The tension in the room was suffocating. Mark froze the moment he saw us. His confident, casual demeanor evaporated instantly, replaced by a look of pure panic. What's going on? He stammered, his eyes darting between us. I stood, my voice icy. Sit down, Mark. I can explain, he started, raising his hands defensively. No, Sarah cut in, her voice sharp and unwavering. You're going to listen. And then you're going to explain everything. No more lies. Mark hesitated but eventually sat, his shoulders slumped in defeat. He looked like a man who knew he was trapped. The questions came fast and relentless. How long has this been going on? I demanded. He avoided my gaze. A little over a year, he muttered. Sarah let out a bitter laugh. A year? You proposed to me 6 months ago. Were you still sleeping with her then? She gestured toward me, her voice breaking. Mark flinched, his face flushing with shame. Yes, he admitted quietly. My stomach turned. I gripped the edge of the table, trying to steady myself. Did you ever plan on telling me? He finally looked at me, his eyes filled with something that resembled regret. I didn't know how, he said. I thought I could figure it out. Make it less painful. Less painful. Sarah snapped, her voice rising. You've been lying to both of us for over a year, Mark. You didn't care about sparing anyone pain. You cared about getting away with it. Mark's head dropped into his hands. I didn't want to hurt either of you, he said weakly. You didn't want to hurt us? I repeated, my voice trembling with fury. You told Sarah I was your ex. You told her Ethan wasn't yours. Do you know how cruel that is? Do you even care? His head snapped up, and for a moment, I thought I saw anger flash in his eyes. Of course I care, he said defensively. I was trying to keep things together. For Ethan. For the baby. For the babies? I spat. You mean the baby you've barely acknowledged since you left? Sarah leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. And what about our baby, Mark? Or was this just another mistake you didn't know how to fix? Mark looked like he wanted to disappear. I made a mess of everything, he said. I know that. But I didn't mean for it to get this far. The more he talked, the clearer it became that Mark wasn't sorry for what he'd done. He was sorry he'd been caught. He didn't deny the lies, didn't try to justify them. He just sat there, claiming he'd been confused and overwhelmed, as if that absolved him of responsibility. But his confession was the final nail in the coffin for me. He'd been living a double life, telling Sarah and me exactly what we needed to hear to keep us in his orbit. He hadn't stumbled into this. He'd planned it, nurtured it, and lied with a precision that left no room for doubt. I can't believe I trusted you, I said finally, my voice breaking. You've destroyed everything. Mark's face crumpled, but I didn't care. I turned to Sarah, who looked just as shattered as I felt. Do you have anything else you want to ask him? She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. I've heard enough. I stood, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. Then get out, I said, glaring at Mark. You're not welcome here anymore. You're done lying to me. To Ethan. To Sarah. Pack your things and leave. Mark opened his mouth to protest, but seemed to think better of it. He stood slowly, looking like he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. I'm sorry, he mumbled weakly. Don't say that, I said coldly. It doesn't mean anything coming from you. Sarah left shortly after, her face pale and her steps unsteady. I don't know what I'm going to do, she admitted at the door. You'll figure it out, I said, offering her a weak smile. We both will. When the door closed behind her, I turned back to Mark. He was in the process of throwing his clothes into a duffel bag, his movements jerky and frustrated. Ethan was asleep upstairs, blissfully unaware of the chaos unraveling below. Where will you go? I asked, my voice devoid of emotion. I don't know, he admitted. Tom's, maybe. Good, I said. You two can commiserate about how terrible women are. He flinched but didn't respond. When he finally left, the silence in the house was deafening. I sat on the couch, staring blankly at the wall, trying to process the reality of what had just happened. My marriage was over. The man I'd loved and trusted for over a decade had shattered my world, and now I was left to pick up the pieces. I didn't cry that night. There was no energy left for tears. Just an overwhelming sense of emptiness. Mark was gone, but the damage he'd done remained, cutting deeper than I ever thought possible. The days following Mark's departure blurred into a haze of anger, sorrow, and exhaustion. I'd wake up every morning with a hollow ache in my chest, only to remember, like a punch to the gut, that my life had been turned upside down. My mornings revolved around Ethan, whose bright laughter and innocent questions were both a comfort and a constant reminder of what I'd lost. My afternoons were consumed by phone calls with lawyers and counselors, navigating the tangled web of divorce proceedings. And my nights? They were the worst. I'd lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to stop replaying every lie, every betrayal, every moment I hadn't seen coming. The fallout from Mark's actions didn't take long to ripple through our social circles. At first, I tried to keep things private, but that became impossible once Sarah's name came up. Mark had left a trail of deceit that was impossible to hide, and soon enough, everyone knew. Our friends were divided. Some tried to justify Mark's actions, pinning the blame on the stress he'd been under because of Tom's situation. He's not a bad guy, one friend said during an awkward phone call. He just broke under the pressure. Broke. I snapped, gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. He didn't break. He planned. He lied. He lived a double life. That's not breaking. That's betrayal. Others, thankfully, cut ties with him entirely. A few even reached out to me to express their shock and disgust. I can't believe he did this to you, one said. You were the perfect couple. Or at least, I thought you were. The word stung. I'd spent years building a life with Mark, believing in the strength of our partnership. To hear that others saw us as perfect only made the cracks in my reality feel deeper. Sarah, surprisingly, became one of my few sources of comfort. We started texting after the confrontation. Our conversations initially focused on piecing together timelines and swapping stories. But over time, we began to bond over our shared devastation. I feel so stupid, she admitted one day during a phone call. He told me everything I wanted to hear. Made me believe I was his future. And the whole time he was with you, building a family. You're not stupid, I told her firmly. He lied to both of us. Manipulated both of us. That's on him, not you. Sarah decided to keep her baby, but she wanted nothing more to do with Mark. I don't care if he's involved or not, she said bitterly. Honestly, I'd prefer he wasn't. But I'll give him the chance, for the baby's sake. If he messes that up, though, I'm done. When I told her about the DNA test, her response surprised me. That doesn't shock me, she said with a hollow laugh. Mark always doubted people. He never said it outright, but there was this vibe. Like he was waiting for the other shoe to drop. I just didn't think he'd do it to you. Her words stuck with me. Mark's distrust hadn't started with Tom's betrayal. It had always been there, simmering beneath the surface, hidden behind his smiles and reassurances. I just hadn't wanted to see it. Amidst the chaos, I tried to focus on preparing for the arrival of my second child. The nursery remained half-finished, a painful reminder of the life I'd thought I was building with Mark. Every time I walked past it, I felt a pang of sadness, but I forced myself to keep moving. Ethan was too young to understand what was happening, but he sensed the tension. He'd ask about Mark occasionally, when's Daddy coming home? And every time, my heart broke a little more. Daddy's staying somewhere else for now, I'd say gently. But he loves you very much. I didn't know if that was true anymore. Mark's version of love felt selfish, conditional, and shallow. But Ethan didn't need to know that. Not yet. As the weeks passed, I began to realize just how much of myself I'd lost in my marriage. I'd built my life around Mark, trusting him to be my partner, my anchor, my home. Without him, I felt adrift, unsure of who I was or what my future would look like. But amidst the pain, there were moments of clarity, moments when I saw the strength I didn't know I had. I'd look at Ethan's smiling face or feel the baby's kicks and remind myself that I wasn't alone. I still had a family. It just wasn't the one I'd envisioned. Mark's betrayal had shattered the life I thought I knew, but it hadn't destroyed me. Slowly, piece by piece, I was learning to rebuild. And this time, I was building for myself and my children, not for him. When Mark first brought up the DNA test again, I wanted to scream at him. The idea of reducing my son, our son, to a scientific report felt degrading, humiliating, and infuriating. Ethan's giggles, his wide brown eyes, his little dimples that mirrored Mark's perfectly. How could anyone look at him and doubt he was his father? But I was exhausted. I had no energy left for another argument, no strength to fight over a test that wouldn't change a thing for me. Fine, I said, my voice cold and emotionless. Do the test. Whatever makes you feel better about yourself. Mark flinched at my tone, but didn't argue. He claimed it wasn't about me, that it was something he needed to do, as if that made it better. The process itself was quick. A lab technician swabbed Ethan's cheek while I held him in my lap, doing my best to act like it was a routine doctor's visit. Ethan, ever curious, kept asking, "What's this for, Mama?" "It's just a little test," I told him, forcing a smile. Mark stood off to the side, silent and tense. I didn't bother looking at him. The sight of him made my stomach churn. The results came back a week later. Mark called to tell me they'd arrived, and I could hear something close to relief in his voice. "Do you want me to come over to talk about it?" he asked. "No," I said flatly. "Just tell me." "Ethan's mine," he said, like it was a fact he'd uncovered rather than one he'd denied for weeks. I didn't respond immediately, gripping the phone tightly. "I told you that from the start," I said finally, my voice quiet but full of bitterness. "You didn't need a test for that. You just needed to trust me." Mark sighed, as if I was the one being unreasonable. "I needed to be sure," he said. The words ignited a fire in me. "You needed to be sure?" "Sure of what?" "That your wife of 10 years, the mother of your children, wasn't a liar and a cheat? That I hadn't betrayed you?" My voice rose with every word, my anger spilling out like a dam had burst. "You destroyed our marriage for this, Mark. For a doubt that didn't even exist until you decided to create it. He didn't have an answer. Or maybe he didn't care enough to give one. After I hung up, I sat in silence for a long time. The results had confirmed what I'd known all along, but there was no sense of victory. I didn't feel vindicated. I just felt hollow. The DNA test hadn't been about Ethan. It had been about Mark, his insecurities, his fears, his need to control everything around him. He'd prioritized those feelings over our family, over me, over everything we'd built together. That realization was more painful than the cheating or the lies. The man I'd loved since I was a teenager, the man I thought I knew better than anyone, had been a stranger all along. When I told Sarah about the results, she wasn't surprised. "He always needs proof," she said with a bitter laugh. "Proof that people won't leave him. Proof that they're not lying to him. Proof that he's not being played. It's exhausting, honestly." "That's not proof," I said, my anger bubbling up again. "It's paranoia. And it's cruel." Sarah nodded.
"He doesn't see it that way.
"He thinks it's just him being careful. But people like that? They're always looking for an excuse to mistrust you. Even when there's nothing to find." Her words hit me hard. For years, I'd brushed off little comments Mark made, questions about old relationships, jokes about men at work, subtle digs disguised as concern. At the time, I thought they were harmless, but now I saw them for what they were. Cracks in his trust, cracks he'd never bothered to repair. By the time Mark asked to meet in person to talk things through, I'd made up my mind. We met at a local coffee shop, neutral ground where I could keep my composure. He looked nervous as he sat across from me, his hands fidgeting with his coffee cup. "I'm sorry," he started, his voice quiet. "For everything. For the test, for doubting you, for all of it." His words rang hollow. I stared at him, searching for sincerity in his eyes, but all I saw was guilt. Not remorse. Not love. Just guilt. "It's too late for apologies, Mark," I said firmly. "You didn't just hurt me. You hurt Ethan. You hurt our family. And you did it all because you couldn't see past your own insecurities." "I was scared," he said, his voice breaking. "After what happened to Tom, You're not Tom," I interrupted, my voice sharp. "I'm not his wife. And Ethan isn't someone else's child. You didn't just let fear control you, Mark. You let it destroy us." He didn't have a response. He just sat there, staring down at his coffee cup, like the answers he was looking for might be hidden at the bottom. I stood, grabbing my bag. "This is the last time we'll talk about this," I said. "If you want to be a father to Ethan and the baby, fine. But as far as I'm concerned, this conversation and this marriage is over." Walking out of that coffee shop, I felt a strange mix of sadness and relief. I wasn't over the pain, not by a long shot. But for the first time, I felt like I was taking control of my life again. The DNA test had been the final blow to a relationship that was already crumbling. And while it hadn't brought me closure, it had brought me clarity. Mark wasn't the man I thought he was, and I wasn't the woman who would stay and let him break me anymore. Filing for divorce felt like the most decisive thing I'd done in years. The paperwork sat on the table for a full day before I finally signed it, my hand shaking with both relief and heartbreak. The moment I sent it off, I felt a weight lift, but it was replaced almost immediately by the crushing reality of what lay ahead. I wasn't just ending my marriage, I was dismantling the life I thought I'd built forever. Therapy became my lifeline. I started seeing a counselor weekly, a soft-spoken woman named Danielle who listened patiently as I poured out my pain, anger, and confusion. "You've been through a profound betrayal," she said during one session. "It's okay to grieve the life you thought you had. But you're stronger than you realize. And now you have the chance to rebuild something just for you." Her words stuck with me. Rebuilding. The idea felt overwhelming, like trying to piece together a shattered vase without any instructions. But I clung to it because it gave me something to hold on to, something to strive for. Ethan, of course, made everything both harder and easier. At 2 years old, he didn't understand why Daddy wasn't home anymore, but he felt the change. "Where's Daddy?" he asked one evening as I tucked him into bed. His wide eyes searched mine, expecting a simple answer. "Daddy's living somewhere else right now," I said softly, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "But he loves you very much." Ethan nodded, seemingly satisfied, but it broke my heart to see the confusion in his eyes. Every time he asked, I repeated the same gentle response, but the words felt emptier each time. Did Mark love him? Or was his love as conditional as it had been for me? I didn't want Ethan to grow up feeling the weight of Mark's failures, so I resolved to shield him from as much of the mess as I could. But that didn't mean it didn't hurt. Mark tried to stay in contact, but his efforts felt hollow. He called occasionally, asking about Ethan or the pregnancy, but the conversations were stilted and awkward. "How's Ethan doing?" he'd ask, and I'd bite back the urge to scream. "You'd know if you were here." He brought up co-parenting several times, saying he wanted to be there for birthdays and milestones. "We need to find a way to make this work," he said during one call. His words made sense on the surface, but I couldn't bring myself to agree. The thought of sitting across from him at Ethan's birthday party, pretending everything was fine for the sake of appearances, made my stomach churn. The pain was too fresh, too raw. "You say that now," I finally replied, my voice cold. "But what happens when it gets hard? When you have to actually show up? Because from where I'm sitting, Mark, all you've done is leave." He didn't respond, and I hung up before I could say anything else I'd regret. Some days were better than others. On good days, I felt a glimmer of hope, like I could actually move forward and build a life for my children that was stable and full of love. I'd take Ethan to the park, feeling the sun on my face as I watched him laugh and play, and for a moment, the pain faded. But on bad days, the weight of it all felt unbearable. I'd sit in the half-finished nursery, staring at the crib I'd once imagined Mark assembling, and wonder how I'd ended up here. The loneliness was suffocating, and the future felt like an endless series of challenges I wasn't sure I could face alone. Danielle encouraged me to focus on small victories. "You don't have to rebuild everything at once," she said. "Start with one piece at a time. What's one thing you can do today to move forwards?" Her advice helped. I started journaling again, pouring my thoughts onto paper in an attempt to make sense of them. I reconnected with old friends, people I'd lost touch with during the years I'd been consumed by my marriage. Slowly, I began to feel like myself again, not the version of me that existed with Mark, but someone new. One evening, as I was cleaning up after dinner, Ethan toddled over to me with a drawing in his hands. "Look, Mama," he said proudly. I knelt down to see it, a crayon masterpiece of stick figures. "Is this us?" I asked, pointing to the figures. "Yeah," he said, nodding. "That's you, and that's me, and that's the baby." My throat tightened as I noticed something missing. "What about Daddy?" Ethan shrugged, like it hadn't even crossed his mind. "Daddy's not here," he said simply, then ran off to play. I sat on the floor for a long time, holding the drawing in my hands. The sadness was still there, but it was joined by something else, a determination to create a life for my children that didn't revolve around Mark's absence. Rebuilding wasn't easy, and it wasn't fast. But piece by piece, I was learning how to do it. For Ethan.
For the baby.
For myself. It feels strange to sit here, reflecting on everything that's happened while my life continues to spin in chaos around me. I'm 6 months pregnant, navigating the storm of a messy divorce, and somehow holding together a life that feels both familiar and unrecognizable. Some mornings, I wake up and forget for a split second that Mark is gone. I reach out for him in the haze of sleep, only to find an empty bed. Other mornings, the reality of his betrayal hits me so hard it feels like I can't breathe. Those are the hardest days, the ones where the grief feels fresh all over again, like a wound I can't keep from reopening. Yet, there's another part of me that feels lighter. It's an odd, unsettling sense of relief, like I've been freed from something I didn't fully understand was holding me back. For years, I built my world around Mark, sacrificing pieces of myself to fit into the mold of what I thought a good wife should be. Now, as painful as it is, I'm realizing that mold never fit me in the first place. The divorce is dragging, as divorces always do. Mark has been civil in his own detached way, but his attempts to negotiate parenting plans and divide assets feel transactional, devoid of the emotion I keep expecting to find in him. He talks about what's fair and what's best for the kids, but I can't help wondering if he really knows what that looks like anymore. Ethan is my focus, along with the baby I'm carrying. Keeping their world stable is the only thing that feels certain right now. Ethan has stopped asking for Mark as often, which is both a blessing and a heartbreak. I see the sadness in his eyes sometimes, the quiet way he watches other kids with their dads at the park. It's a reminder that Mark's absence isn't just my loss, it's his too. As for the baby, I feel an ache of guilt every time I think about bringing another child into this chaos. But then I feel a kick, strong and insistent, and it reminds me that life is still moving forward. This baby deserves love, stability, and a future full of possibility. And I'll give them that no matter what it takes. Mark's betrayal has left scars, ones I'm not sure will ever fully heal. Trust feels like an impossible mountain to climb, a language I no longer speak fluently. When I imagine the idea of letting someone else into my life someday, I feel a sharp pang of resistance, as if my heart is warning me not to risk it again. But even with that fear, I've learned something important. I deserve better. I don't know if better means finding someone new, or simply building a life where I don't need to depend on anyone else for my happiness. Either way, I know I won't settle again. Mark's betrayal didn't just shatter my marriage, it shattered the illusion that I had to accept less than I deserved. As I write this, Ethan is asleep upstairs, his tiny body curled up in his favorite blanket. The baby is kicking, a constant reminder of the life growing inside me, the future that's still unwritten. My house is quieter than it's ever been, but for the first time, I don't feel the silence pressing down on me. I don't know what the future holds, and I've stopped trying to predict it. What I do know is that I'll keep moving forward, one day at a time. I'll build a life for my children that's full of love, safety, and joy. And for myself, I'll find peace, not the kind that comes from pretending everything is fine, but the kind that comes from knowing I survived, I learned, and I grew stronger. Mark may have been part of my story, but he's not the whole book. And I'm determined to write the next chapters on my terms.